You need to watch this if you crave chills down your spine. Welcome to Soul Studios. Here, true crime meets the unknown. Suspense lurks in every shadow, and supernatural forces whisper from the dark. We craft chilling, edge-of-your-seat short stories inspired by the eerie, the unexplained, and the most haunting mysteries. 3 new stories drop every week, each one darker than the last. Are you ready to step inside? Subscribe now before the next story finds you.
There's a door inside this store, a door that was never supposed to be there, a door that once opened never truly lets you leave. This is Peak Performance Outfitters, a sporting goods store in the quiet town of Silver Pines. But this isn't just a store, it's a trap, a graveyard, a hunting ground. It started with Jamie Caldwell, a store clerk just trying to open up for the day. But when she stepped inside, she knew something was wrong. The mannequins had moved. The air was thick, heavy, and from the stockroom, she heard it, a slow, dragging sound. She did the only thing she could do. She ran. But when the cops arrived, they weren't prepared for what they found. And then they saw it. They call it the Watcher. It doesn't run. It waits. It watches. And the moment you look at it for too long, you disappear. People have vanished from this land for generations. Before the store, before Silver Pines even existed, this place has been taking people. The only way to stop it, burn everything. But what if fire isn't enough? What if it's only waiting for the next door to open? You shouldn't have come back. The last door. A horror story you won't forget. Subscribe now. The shadows are waiting. The morning air in Silver Pines, Montana was crisp, carrying the scent of pine trees and damp earth. Nestled in a valley between towering snow-capped mountains, the town was the kind of place where people left their doors unlocked and strangers still waved at each other on the street. It wasn't big, maybe 5,000 residents, give or take, but it had charm. A historic downtown with brick sidewalks, a single-screen movie theatre that played the same film for weeks, and a main street dotted with mom-and-pop shops that had been around for decades. Peak Performance Outfitters sat at the edge of town, a squat, modern-looking sporting goods store built where the old railway station used to be. The shop catered to local hikers, hunters, and the occasional tourist passing through on their way to Glacier National Park. With its clean glass windows and bold blue signage, it was a sharp contrast to the rustic wooden storefronts nearby. But Jamie Caldwell had never minded that. The store was a good job, steady hours, and gave her enough to cover rent on her small apartment above Maggie's Diner, one of the oldest restaurants in Silver Pines. Jamie had lived in this town for nearly 10 years now. Her mom had packed up and moved them here from Denver when she was 13, desperate for a fresh start after her dad walked out. She never liked to talk about him, and Jamie had learned early on not to ask. It had just been the two of them since, scraping by in a new town where they didn't know anyone. Eventually, Jamie grew to love the quiet, the deep forests, and the clear, starlit skies at night. Even now, at 23, she had no real desire to leave. She pulled into the nearly empty parking lot of Peak Performance, her old Subaru Outback humming as it came to a stop. It was still early, 6:45 a.m., and the sun had barely risen, painting the mountains in soft pinks and oranges. She grabbed her coffee from the cup holder and took a deep breath. Mondays were always slow, but that was fine with her. She liked the peace before customers started trickling in. Stepping out, she pulled her jacket tighter around her. The morning chill was sharper than usual for late September. She made her way to the front doors, fumbling with the keys in one hand while taking a sip of her coffee with the other. The metal key slid into the lock with a familiar click, and she pushed the door open and stopped. Something was wrong. The store should have been dark, silent, but the moment the door swung open, an unnatural stillness settled over her. The scent of the place was off. Normally there was a faint mix of rubber, leather, and fresh cotton from new inventory. But today, the air carried something sharper, something metallic. Jamie hesitated in the doorway, her breath catching. Her eyes flicked across the store, trying to pinpoint what was wrong. At first glance, everything seemed normal. The rows of neatly stacked hiking boots, the racks of waterproof jackets, the towering display of mannequins dressed in the latest outdoor gear. but something was off. Then she noticed it. The mannequins. She had closed last night, and she knew for a fact they hadn't been like this. Someone had moved them. The group of mannequins near the camping section had been set up in a casual, welcoming pose, hikers with backpacks, one tying a boot. But now they all faced the entrance, all 5 of them, standing there like silent sentinels, staring directly at her. A chill ran up her spine, her fingers tightened around the door handle, and then a sound, soft, faint, a dragging noise from the back of the store. Jamie's breath hitched, her pulse spiking. She strained to hear, heart pounding in her ears. The sound came again, slow, deliberate, like something heavy being pulled across the floor. Someone was inside. Her instincts screamed at her to run, but her body locked up for a fraction of a second. Then, movement. A shadow, just past the edge of her vision, near the hallway that led to the stockroom. That was it. Jamie spun on her heels and bolted. She barely registered the clatter of her coffee cup hitting the pavement as she sprinted to her car. Her hands fumbled for her phone, her breath ragged as she yanked open the car door and practically threw herself inside. Her fingers shook as she punched in the numbers. 911. The dial tone rang once, then a click. Silver Pines Emergency Dispatch, what's your emergency? Jamie sucked in a breath. Someone's inside the store. Ma'am, are you in danger? I don't know. She swallowed, glancing back at the still open store doors. The mannequins stood frozen in place, staring at nothing. The store itself was silent. Too silent. And then the dragging sound again, louder, coming closer. She slammed the car door shut, voice barely above a whisper. Send someone, please. The early morning mist clung to the streets of Silver Pines, curling around street lamps and stretching long shadows across the quiet parking lot of Peak Performance Outfitters. The sky was still a deep shade of indigo, the last remnants of night refusing to give way to dawn. A cold breeze stirred fallen leaves across the pavement, their rustling the only sound besides Jamie's shaky breathing. She sat in her Subaru, parked a few spaces away from the storefront, gripping her phone so tightly her knuckles had turned white. Even though she was no longer inside, the store's eerie stillness had followed her out, a presence lingering just beneath the surface. Jamie had been inside for only a few seconds, but those seconds had felt wrong. The store wasn't how she had left it. And then there was the sound. That slow, deliberate dragging noise from the back of the store. Her first call had been to 911. She had spoken in a hushed, panicked whisper, her words spilling out in fragmented bursts as she told the dispatcher what had happened. Her second call had been to Richard Weller, the store owner. Richard had answered groggily, his voice thick with sleep. "Jamie, what time is it?" "Something's wrong at the store." There had been a long pause. "What do you mean, wrong?" Jamie had exhaled, glancing at the darkened storefront through her windshield. The mannequins were still visible just inside, stiff and silent, positioned too perfectly. "I opened the door and it felt off," she said quietly. "The mannequins were moved, and then I heard," she swallowed, forcing herself to say it, "something, from the back, like something was being dragged." Richard's voice had lost its sleepiness. "Did you see anyone?" "No," Jamie admitted, "but I panicked and ran. I called the cops. They're on their way." Richard hesitated before finally saying, "I'm coming. Don't go back inside." Jamie hadn't needed it to be told twice. Now, as she sat waiting, her stomach twisted as she saw a patrol car pull into the lot. The red and blue lights flashed for only a second before being shut off, leaving the scene illuminated only by the street lamps and the soft glow of the emergency lights inside the store. Detective Ava Sinclair and Officer Eli Mercer stepped out of the vehicle, moving with practiced efficiency. Sinclair, a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s, carried herself with the quiet authority of someone who had seen worse than this, but still took everything seriously. Mercer, younger but just as alert, scanned the building like he was already forming a plan in his head. His hand hovered near his holster, fingers tensed but not drawn. Jamie took a shaky breath and rolled down her window as Sinclair approached. "You called it in?" Sinclair's voice was even, her tone more assessing than alarmed. Jamie nodded quickly. "Yeah, I got here early to open, and the second I stepped inside, She shivered. It felt wrong. Sinclair studied her. Define wrong. Jamie exhaled, trying to keep her voice steady. The mannequins were moved. I know exactly how I set them up last night. They weren't facing the door, but when I came in, they were. Sinclair glanced at Mercer. Any sign of forced entry? Jamie shook her head. Not that I saw. Sinclair turned back to her. You mentioned a sound. Jamie's hands tightened in her lap. It was coming from the back hallway. A dragging sound, slow, heavy. Mercer's gaze flicked to the store. You see anyone? No, Jamie admitted. I ran. Mercer nodded, as if approving of her instincts. Sinclair adjusted her jacket against the cold morning air. Good call. She motioned toward the parking lot. Stay here. Lock your doors. Jamie barely managed a nod as she watched the two officers approach the entrance. Inside Peak Performance Outfitters. The second they stepped inside, the temperature dropped. Sinclair paused in the doorway, glancing at the faint red glow from the emergency lights positioned along the ceiling. They shouldn't be on, Mercer muttered. Sinclair agreed. If the power had gone out, the registers and front signage wouldn't still be running. Something had tripped them. The store was quiet, too quiet. Sinclair's boots made no sound against the polished floor as she stepped forward. Shelves of hiking boots and outdoor gear stood undisturbed. Racks of waterproof jackets swayed slightly from the draft as the door shut behind them. Mercer muttered under his breath, "Creepy as hell." Sinclair ignored him, sweeping her flashlight over the aisles. Nothing looked out of place. But the stillness, the way the air seemed to press against them, made it feel as if they had just stepped into something waiting for them. Then her beam landed on the mannequins. She slowed, 5 of them, all facing the door. Mercer frowned. Jamie said they were moved? Sinclair nodded. She said they weren't like this when she locked up last night. Mercer hesitated. How many were supposed to be here? 5. Mercer exhaled. Then why do I count 6? Sinclair's pulse quickened. Mercer's flashlight beam passed over the row of mannequins again, his jaw tightening. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, a noise. Soft, distant, a slow, deliberate dragging sound. Sinclair froze. Mercer's posture stiffened. That's coming from the back. Sinclair motioned for him to follow, and they moved carefully toward the stockroom hallway. The emergency lights flickered. The smell of metal and dust thickened. Then, a sharp bang from the stockroom door. Both officers jerked to a stop. The sound echoed, bouncing off the walls. Sinclair's flashlight landed on the stockroom door. The handle was turning, slowly, deliberately. Mercer's breath hitched. Tell me that's the wind. Sinclair tightened her grip on her weapon. Then, the lights cut out completely. For a single, suffocating second, there was only silence. Then the dragging sound started again, closer this time. For a moment the store was completely dark, a void of silence so absolute that Jamie, waiting in the parking lot, could feel its weight even from outside. Then, the emergency lights flickered back to life. The dim, reddish glow cast eerie shadows against the aisles, warping the space in unnatural ways. The faint buzz of electricity filled the stillness, but something about it felt off. Detective Sinclair's breath was steady, her gun raised as she stared at the stockroom door. The handle had stopped turning. Mercer's fingers hovered over his radio. Dispatch, we need backup at Peak Performance. Possible intruder in the building. Static. Then, a whisper. Soft, muffled, as if coming from inside the walls. Sinclair's heart pounded. Mercer exhaled sharply. I don't like this. Neither did she. Sinclair stepped closer to the stockroom door. The metallic scent in the air was stronger now, coppery, thick. She recognized it instantly. Blood. Her fingers brushed the doorknob. Cold. She exchanged a glance with Mercer. On my count, Mercer nodded, gun raised. 1. Sinclair took a deep breath. 2. The silence felt too still, like the entire store was holding its breath. 3. Sinclair shoved the door open. The dim stockroom stretched before them, lined with towering shelves full of unopened boxes, outdoor equipment, and old inventory. The air was stale and damp, thick with the scent of dust, and something else. Something wrong. Then Sinclair's flashlight beam landed on the floor. She froze. A long, dark smear of blood stretched across the concrete, disappearing behind a row of shelves. Mercer muttered a curse. Jesus! Sinclair stepped forward, careful not to disturb the blood. It was fresh. Near the smear, something lay on its side. A shoe. Sinclair crouched, shining her light over it. A running sneaker. The laces were frayed, torn. The side scuffed as if its owner had been dragged. Mercer exhaled, his stance tightening. Someone was pulled back here. Sinclair swept her light toward the shelves. The trail of blood vanished behind the metal racks, disappearing into the shadows. Something wasn't right. The stockroom had one way in and one way out. Whoever had left this blood, where were they? Then, a sound, a clicking noise. Sinclair stiffened. Mercer had heard it too. He turned toward the far end of the stockroom, his fingers tightening around his gun. "Tell me you heard that." Sinclair nodded slowly. "Yeah." Another sound, a slow, deliberate creak, like something shifting behind the shelves. Sinclair motioned for Mercer to move left, while she took the right. They approached the far end of the stockroom carefully, their footfalls nearly silent against the cold concrete. The air grew colder. Then, bang! A metallic crash from the other side of the shelf. Sinclair spun, gun raised. The storage bins had toppled over. The shoe was gone. Mercer took a step forward, his voice low. "Something's in here." Sinclair's pulse hammered. No, not something. Someone. Then, a whisper, right behind them. Sinclair whirled, flashlight cutting across the darkness. Nothing, just the rows of untouched inventory. But she felt it now. They were being watched. Mercer exhaled, his breath unsteady. "We need to sweep the store." Sinclair's jaw tightened. Agreed. They backed toward the door, eyes scanning every shadow. Sinclair's hand tightened on her flashlight. Something was in here with them, and whatever it wasn't alone. The store felt different now, colder, still. Sinclair and Mercer stood just outside the stockroom, their breaths coming fast, their nerves wound tight. The mannequin in the doorway had moved, not much, but enough, and now it was gone. Jamie had been watching from her car. Sinclair knew she had seen something, seen them move. But now, as Sinclair shone her flashlight back toward the hallway, the space was empty. The stockroom door, which had slammed shut seconds ago, stood slightly ajar again. Mercer muttered, "This place is messing with us." Sinclair kept her gun raised, her pulse hammering against her ribs. "No," she murmured, "someone's messing with us." Mercer exhaled, shaking his head. Then where the hell did they go? That was the question, wasn't it? Sinclair stepped toward the stockroom, her flashlight sweeping the rows of untouched inventory, the floor where the blood had been, but wasn't any more. Everything looked normal, but it wasn't. Her instincts screamed that something was off. Then she saw it. The writing, carved into the concrete wall near the back of the stockroom, just deep enough to scrape the surface. The letters were jagged, uneven. "Don't look at him." Sinclair's breath hitched. Mercer stepped closer, his flashlight running over the rough indentations. "Jesus," he whispered. "Who wrote this?" Sinclair ran her fingers over the letters, feeling the uneven grooves. It wasn't old. It was fresh, as if someone had written it just before they disappeared. She exhaled. "Maybe the same person who left the blood." Mercer swallowed. "What does it mean?" Sinclair didn't answer, because the answer was already forming in her mind, and she didn't like it. Something was missing. They did a sweep of the store, every aisle, every section. The mannequin that had been blocking the stockroom? Gone. The shoe? Gone. The blood stain that had stretched across the floor. As if it had never existed, and yet they had seen it. And Sinclair's gut told her that whatever was happening inside Peak Performance Outfitters was not natural. Mercer finally sighed, holstering his weapon. "There's no one here." Sinclair wasn't convinced. Someone had been here, and now they weren't. Her eyes flicked toward the mannequins still standing near the entrance. The ones that Jamie had sworn were different when she arrived. They stood perfectly still, plastic faces blank and unblinking. But Sinclair felt it, that gut-wrenching certainty. They were being watched. She exhaled, turning toward the entrance. "We regroup. We come back with more officers, more eyes on this place." Mercer nodded. Agreed. They stepped toward the front of the store, and then a sound, a low scraping noise. Not behind them, not from the stockroom. This time it was coming from above. Sinclair's blood went cold. She and Mercer froze, staring up at the ceiling. The overhead vents, the exposed rafters, the places where no one should be, and yet there it was again, that dragging sound, moving, shifting, right above them. Sinclair's voice was barely a whisper. "Mercer." Mercer's jaw was tight, his eyes locked on the ceiling. "Yeah, I hear it." The air seemed to press in like the store was holding its breath. Then a whisper, soft, close, so close it might have been right behind them. Sinclair's instinct screamed, "Move." She turned sharply. Nothing. Mercer cursed under his breath. "We need to get out, now." Sinclair nodded once. They pushed forward, toward the glass doors, toward Jamie waiting outside in her car. And then, a deep, metallic slam. Sinclair spun. The stockroom door had shut again. The sound echoed through the empty aisles, bouncing off the walls, ringing in her ears. She lifted her flashlight, shining it back toward the darkened hallway. Nothing moved. The mannequins hadn't shifted. The store was silent. But the feeling hadn't gone away. That feeling of being watched. That feeling that something was just beyond her line of sight. That feeling that whatever had been here was still very much here, watching, waiting. She turned back toward Mercer. "We come back." Mercer exhaled, shaking his head. "Yeah, but next time we're bringing backup." Sinclair nodded. For now, they were leaving. But whatever was inside Peak Performance Outfitters, it wasn't done with them yet. The sun had begun its descent by the time Richard Weller arrived at Peak Performance Outfitters. He pulled his truck into the parking lot, barely slowing as he parked. The moment he stepped out, he was already fastening the buttons of his coat, his expression pulled into a frown. Richard had owned Peak Performance for over 10 years. He'd built this place from the ground up, turned it into a staple of Silver Pines. But today felt wrong. The store looked normal. The large glass windows reflected the dull glow of the street lamps. The logo above the entrance still stood bold and blue, but something about it unsettled him. Jamie was waiting near her car, arms crossed, attention in her stance. She'd always been a good employee, showed up on time, did her work, never caused problems. But when she had called him this morning, something in her voice had given him pause. Now, looking at her, he could tell she was still shaken. Richard sighed, stepping toward her. "All right, kid. Tell me what's going on." Jamie exhaled, glancing back at the darkened storefront. "I told you already. I opened the store and it felt wrong." Richard's frown deepened. "Wrong how?" Jamie hesitated, rubbing her arms against the cold. "The mannequins moved. I know how I left them last night. And then I heard," she hesitated, lowering her voice, "something in the back." Richard glanced at the police car still parked nearby. Detective Sinclair and Officer Mercer stood a few feet away, speaking in hushed tones. Richard waved at them. "Didn't think calling the cops was necessary over a couple of mannequins, Jamie." She snapped her gaze to him, frustration flashing in her eyes. "I know what I saw." Richard sighed, running a hand through his greying hair. "Look, I don't have time for ghost stories. I have an entire inventory order to go through." He gestured toward the store. "Let's go inside, check it out, and figure out what's going on." Jamie stiffened. "I'm not going back in there." Richard frowned. "It's just a store." Sinclair stepped forward then, her expression unreadable. "We searched the place earlier. No sign of forced entry, but something's off." Richard raised an eyebrow. "Something off?" Mercer muttered. "The place is wrong. Feels like someone's been moving things when we're not looking." Richard let out a dry laugh. "Come on, you think we have a ghost?" Sinclair didn't laugh. Neither did Jamie. Richard shook his head. "Fine, you're all creeped out, whatever." He pulled his keys from his coat pocket and strode toward the front doors. Jamie didn't move. Sinclair did. "We're coming in with you." Richard shrugged, unlocking the door. The store welcomed them with silence. Inside Peak Performance Outfitters. The first thing Richard noticed was the cold. It was too cold for a building with central heating. The second thing? The mannequins. They stood in the exact same place as always, lined near the entrance, positioned like hikers preparing for an adventure. But something about them. He couldn't place it. Jamie had been so sure they had moved. He shook off the thought and made his way to the checkout counter. See? Nothing weird here. Just a regular store. Jamie hovered near the entrance. Mercer glanced around, his hand never straying far from his holster. Sinclair exhaled. "Let's just do a quick walkthrough." Richard waved them off. "Do what you want. I need to check our delivery logs." He leaned over the counter, sorting through stacks of paperwork left from the night before. The computer monitor flickered, the screen distorting for a second before snapping back. Richard frowned. Great. Probably a power issue. Behind him, Sinclair and Mercer slowly walked through the aisles, their flashlights sweeping over the shelves. Jamie stayed near the entrance, arms wrapped tightly around herself. Then, a noise. A soft shuffle. Richard barely noticed it at first. He assumed it was the officers moving around. But Jamie did. Her body went rigid. She turned toward the camping section. The air shifted. Something moved. Sinclair's flashlight swung toward the aisle. Richard glanced up. What? Silence. Nothing there. Jamie's fingers tightened into fists. Did you hear that? Sinclair didn't answer. Richard rolled his eyes. All right, enough of this. I'm checking the back room. Sinclair turned sharply. I wouldn't. Richard scoffed. It's my store. Before she could argue, he pushed through the swinging doors into the back hallway. The stockroom. The smell was the first thing Richard noticed. Metallic. Dusty. Stale. He wrinkled his nose, flicking on the overhead light. The bulbs buzzed weakly, casting a dim glow over the shelves stacked with extra inventory, boxes half opened from deliveries. Everything looked normal, but the feeling in the air wasn't. He moved toward the metal desk in the corner, flipping through more invoices. Then, a sound. A soft, slow creak. Richard froze. It had come from the far end of the room. He turned, scanning the shelves. Nothing. Then, another creak. Richard's pulse picked up. His eyes landed on the storage closet tucked against the back wall. The door was slightly ajar. He frowned. Jamie, you forget to lock this? No answer. He sighed and stepped toward the door. It was probably just left open. The hinges groaned as he pushed it open. Inside, only darkness. He reached for the light switch. Then, something moved. Fast. A blur of motion in the shadows. Richard barely had time to react before the light shut off. Total blackness. A chill raced down his spine. Then, the whisper, right behind him. Don't look. Richard's breath hitched. The air turned frigid. And then a hand, cold, too long, too thin, brushed against his shoulder. Richard spun, heart hammering, arms out. Nothing. The storage closet was empty. The door swung open wider, creaking slightly. Richard stumbled backward, his breath coming fast. He rushed out of the stockroom, slamming the door behind him. Back in the main store, Sinclair, Mercer and Jamie all looked up. Richard was breathing hard. He wiped a hand over his face. You know what? Jamie raised an eyebrow. Yeah? Richard exhaled. I think I'm closing early. Jamie nodded. Good call. Sinclair and Mercer exchanged a look. This wasn't over. Not even close. Richard Weller locked the front doors to Peak Performance Outfitters, his fingers tightening around the keys as the deadbolt clicked into place. His store had never felt like this before. Jamie still stood near her car, arms wrapped tightly around herself, her gaze locked on the darkened storefront. The police vehicle was parked a few spaces away, Detective Sinclair and Officer Mercer standing by, their quiet conversation barely audible. Richard exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. All right, he muttered. Someone tell me what the hell is going on in my store. Jamie spoke first, her voice hesitant but firm. I think I know. Richard turned toward her, frowning. What? Jamie swallowed, her fingers tightening around the strap of her bag. I've been looking into the history of this place, of the land the store was built on. Richard raised an eyebrow. Why? Jamie hesitated, then exhaled. Because of Ryan Turner. Sinclair's gaze sharpened. The missing college student? Jamie nodded. When he disappeared, it didn't make sense to me. He was my friend. I worked with him. He wasn't the type to just leave town without telling anyone. Richard shifted uncomfortably. People disappear all the time. Jamie turned to face him fully. Not like this. Sinclair crossed her arms. What do you mean? Jamie took a slow breath. Ryan was here the night he disappeared. He was on the closing shift. He even texted me earlier that night about inventory being off. She pulled out her phone, scrolling until she found the message. She handed it to Sinclair. Sinclair's eyes flicked over the text. Ryan. Hey! Is it just me, or are the mannequins in the wrong place? Thought you were the last to leave yesterday. Jamie pointed to the timestamp. That was the last time anyone heard from him. Sinclair frowned. And you never told the police this? Jamie's expression tightened. I did, but they didn't do anything. They assumed he just left town. Mercer muttered under his breath. Sounds familiar. Richard exhaled, rubbing his temple. All right, so you did some research. What did you find? Jamie glanced toward the store again before answering. This land has a history. A bad one. Sinclair narrowed her eyes. Explain. Jamie pulled a folded document from her bag and handed it to Sinclair. Before the train station, before the town even expanded out this far, there was something else here. Richard took the paper, his eyes skimming over the text. Silver Pines Gazette, 1886. The old lodge, once a haven for trappers and hunters, has long been abandoned. Many in town whisper of strange happenings in the woods beyond, speaking of those who come through and never return. The lodge is said to have been home to a group of men who called themselves the Watchers, claiming to have seen what lurks in the trees, and warning others not to stay past nightfall. But warnings do little when faced with the unknown. The latest disappearance, young Henry Wallace, marks the 7th in the last 3 years. Richard looked up. So what? Some hunters disappeared? Jamie shook her head. Not just hunters, travellers, workers, people passing through. She hesitated, then added, and they all vanished under the same circumstances. Sinclair's grip on the paper tightened. What circumstances? Jamie exhaled. They were last seen looking at something. Silence. Jamie continued, her voice lower now. According to what I found, people reported seeing them staring at the woods, or standing too still, not responding when spoken to. Then, the next morning, they were gone. Richard shook his head. That was over a century ago. Jamie nodded. Right, and after the lodge was shut down, the train station was built over it. But the disappearances didn't stop. Sinclair pulled out a second document, another old police report. She read aloud. July 24th, 1949, local railway worker Edward Malone reported missing after final shift at Silver Pines Station. Fellow employees state he had been acting strange in the days leading up to his disappearance, often found standing by the tracks, staring toward the tree line. He was last seen clocking out of his shift at 10:17 p.m. His belongings remained untouched in his station locker. He was never seen again. Jamie's voice dropped to a whisper. It kept happening. Every few years. Workers, passengers, people who stared too long at the wrong place. Mercer muttered, and when they tore the station down in the 70s, it stopped. Jamie nodded. Until this store was built. Richard felt the weight of it. This land, his store, had been built over a place where people had disappeared. Where something had been watching. He exhaled sharply. And now you think it's happening again? Jamie's throat tightened. Ryan's not the only one. Sinclair stiffened. What do you mean? Jamie pulled out another police report. This one was newer. 2019, Sinclair's brows furrowed as she read. November 5th, 2019. Missing persons report filed for local teenager Daniel Henshaw. Last seen near Peak Performance Outfitters around 9:30 p.m. Surveillance cameras from nearby businesses captured no evidence of his departure. Phone records indicate his device was still active within store premises at 10:02 p.m. before shutting off completely. Search efforts yielded no results. Jamie's voice was barely above a whisper. I knew him. He was one of Ryan's friends. He came here a lot, and then he was just gone. Richard felt the hair on his arms rise. Sinclair flipped through the papers again. So that's 3 missing people, all connected to this property. Mercer let out a slow breath. What the hell is this place? Jamie swallowed. I think it's something old, something that's always been here. Richard clenched his jaw. That's ridiculous. Jamie turned to him, her eyes dark. Then where's Ryan? Richard opened his mouth to argue, then a creak. Everyone froze. The sound had come from inside the store. Sinclair snapped her head toward the glass doors. The store was empty. But the mannequins had moved, all of them, standing directly in front of the entrance, facing them, watching. Sinclair's breath was steady, but her fingers tightened around her holster. Mercer whispered, Tell me someone moved those. No one had. The air felt wrong. Jamie took a step back. Sinclair exhaled. We're coming back. We're figuring this out. Richard clenched his fists. His store, his land, his problem. He squared his shoulders. Then I'm coming with you. Jamie looked at him, eyes uncertain. Sinclair didn't argue. Mercer nodded, still staring at the mannequins. Yeah, but next time we bring backup. Because whatever was happening inside Peak Performance Outfitters, it wasn't done with them yet. The wind howled through the empty streets of Silver Pines, sending leaves skittering across the pavement as the group stood just outside Peak Performance Outfitters. The mannequins still stood behind the glass doors, perfectly arranged, perfectly still, watching. Sinclair stared at them for a long moment before turning back to Mercer. We need more officers on this. Mercer exhaled, rubbing his hands over his face. We're going to sound insane if we file a report saying mannequins are moving on their own. Sinclair's voice was deadly serious. We already sound insane. Richard gritted his teeth. His store was locked, his business shut down until they figured out what the hell was happening. "We're not leaving this unanswered," he muttered. "I built this place. I need to know what's inside." Jamie shuddered, still staring at the motionless mannequins. "We shouldn't be standing out here." Sinclair agreed. If something inside was watching them, standing here in the open made them too vulnerable. She turned to Richard. "We'll meet at the station. We need a plan before we step back inside." Richard hesitated. He hated leaving his store like this. Empty, silent, wrong. But he nodded. They left, and behind them, unseen through the glass, one of the mannequins tilted its head. Silver Pines Police Department, 9:45 p.m. The police station was quiet at this hour. Only a few officers at their desks, shuffling paperwork and making calls. The fluorescent lighting cast a harsh glow over the space, but somehow it felt safer than the store. Sinclair sat at the conference table. The documents Jamie had collected spread out before her. Newspaper clippings, old police reports, property records dating back to the 1800s. Richard leaned over the table, arms crossed, jaw tight. He still didn't fully understand how his store was connected to something this old, this unnatural. Mercer flipped through a file. "All right, let's list what we actually know." Sinclair nodded. "We know people went missing on that land as far back as the late 1800s, first at the hunting lodge, then at the train station." Jamie added, "and now at the store." Mercer tapped the most recent missing person report. Ryan Turner. The last place he was seen was Peak Performance, but no cameras caught him leaving. Richard frowned. "That doesn't mean anything. Cameras glitch. Maybe he left through a back exit." Jamie shook her head. "That's just it. There is no back exit." Sinclair met Richard's gaze. "We checked the store. There's one way in, one way out." Richard exhaled, running a hand through his greying hair. He didn't want to believe it. Didn't want to believe that something impossible had happened inside his store. Mercer's voice was quieter now. "The real question is, where do they go?" The room fell into silence. Sinclair's mind was already forming an answer, one she didn't like. They weren't leaving the store. They were still inside. Somewhere. Richard finally spoke, voice rough. "Then we go back in." Jamie's stomach turned. Mercer let out a dry laugh. "You're eager to walk back into that?" Richard shook his head. "I'm not eager for anything. But I'm not going to sit here while my store, my livelihood, gets turned into a goddamn ghost story." Sinclair nodded. "We don't go in blind this time. We bring the right equipment." Jamie shifted uncomfortably. "What kind of equipment?" Sinclair started listing. "Thermal cameras, EMF meters, body cams. We record everything." Mercer exhaled sharply. "We're treating this like a crime scene." Sinclair met his gaze. "It is a crime scene." Mercer hesitated, then nodded. Richard crossed his arms. "When?" Sinclair glanced at the clock. "Midnight." Jamie's breath caught. "Why midnight?" Sinclair's expression was unreadable. "Because that's when the store is completely empty. No distractions. No people walking by." She tapped the documents. Every disappearance, every strange incident, they happened late at night. Jamie swallowed hard. "You think that's when it's active?" Sinclair didn't answer. She didn't have to. Peak Performance Outfitters, 11:55 p.m. The store looked the same. Jamie sat in the passenger seat of Sinclair's unmarked car, staring out at the glass doors. The mannequins were still there, but now there were more of them. Jamie's throat tightened. There weren't that many before. Sinclair followed her gaze. She was right. The mannequins had multiplied. Richard parked his truck 2 spaces over. Mercer stepped out, adjusting his body cam and double-checking the equipment in the back. Sinclair exhaled, grabbing a thermal camera from the passenger seat. "All right," she said. "This time, we don't split up." Jamie swallowed hard, gripping her flashlight. "And if we see something?" Sinclair met her gaze. "Don't look at it for too long." Jamie's breath caught. "Why?" Sinclair hesitated before answering. "The old reports, the hunting lodge, the train station, they all say the same thing." She glanced toward the darkened storefront. The missing people were last seen staring at something. Jamie's pulse spiked. Sinclair's fingers tightened on her gun. "Let's go." They stepped out of the car. The wind had died. The streetlights flickered faintly, and inside the store's glass doors the mannequins stood perfectly still, facing them, waiting. The click of the lock turning sent a cold wave through Jamie's body. Richard pushed open the door to Peak Performance Outfitters, and the store welcomed them with silence. Sinclair was the first to step inside. body cam activated, her flashlight cutting through the dim glow of the emergency lights. Richard followed, jaw clenched, his gaze scanning the aisles with an unreadable expression. Jamie hesitated. Something about this moment, stepping inside at midnight knowing something was waiting, felt wrong. But Mercer placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You don't have to do this," he said quietly. Jamie swallowed. Yes, she did. She took a deep breath and stepped inside. The door shut behind them with a soft click. Inside the store, the air was stagnant, heavy. Jamie felt it settle against her skin, clinging like humidity but without the heat. Sinclair motioned for Mercer to start the thermal scan. He lifted the small device, the screen flickering with waves of blue and red, mapping the store's temperature readings. Nothing unusual, yet. Richard exhaled, forcing himself forward. "I don't know what we're expecting to find here." Sinclair didn't answer. Jamie wasn't sure what she was expecting either. All she knew was that the store felt different. Off. Mercer moved through the aisles, his body cam light flickering against the camping gear, the neatly folded clothes, the mannequin display. Then he stopped. Sinclair turned toward him. "What is it?" Mercer hesitated, staring at the thermal screen. "There's a heat source." Jamie's stomach twisted. "Where?" Mercer swallowed. "The stockroom." Silence. Richard exhaled sharply. "It's just the building settling. Old pipes, maybe." Sinclair ignored him. "We check it out." Jamie didn't want to, but she followed. They moved carefully, weaving past the silent mannequins, their plastic faces frozen in unnatural stillness. As they reached the back hallway, Sinclair raised a hand. "Stop!" Jamie's pulse pounded. "What?" Sinclair lifted her flashlight and pointed to the floor. Footprints. Bare. Human, trailing out from the stockroom. Jamie stopped breathing. Richard's face drained of colour. "There's someone here." Sinclair crouched, examining the prints. They were fresh. Mercer muttered, "They're leading to the aisles." Jamie felt her chest tighten. They weren't alone. Sinclair stood. "Flashlights up." Mercer raised his thermal camera. Jamie clenched her flashlight so hard her fingers ached. They followed the footprints back into the store, through the aisles, past the mannequins. Then, a noise, a soft, deliberate shuffling. Sinclair's flashlight whipped toward the sound. Nothing. Then Mercer whispered, "Wait." Jamie's blood went cold, because Mercer was staring at the thermal screen. And there, right in front of them, next to the mannequin display, was a heat signature. Something was standing there. Sinclair's breath came out slow. She didn't see anything. But the camera did. It was tall, still, right beside the mannequins. Jamie felt it now. Something was there, watching, waiting. Then, the mannequins moved. Jamie choked on a scream, not all of them, just one. A slow, unnatural twitch of its arm, then its head turning toward them. Jamie stumbled backward. "It's moving." Mercer gritted his teeth. "It's standing right there." Richard took a step forward, his hand hovering near his pocket knife. This is a prank." His voice wavered. Then, the thermal image blinked out, gone. Sinclair's flashlight swept across the mannequins. They were motionless again. Jamie's breath shook. Mercer checked the thermal cam. Nothing. Richard swallowed hard, muttering, "I think we should leave." Then a sound from above, a slow, deliberate scraping. Jamie's breath hitched. What the hell is that?" They all looked up, the ceiling vents, the exposed rafters. The sound was coming from inside them. Sinclair whispered, "Something's in the ceiling." Then the lights cut out. Total, suffocating, darkness. Jamie's chest tightened. No. A loud thud sounded overhead. Something dropped. Jamie felt the floor vibrate beneath her. Then, breathing, directly behind them. Sinclair whirled around. Her flashlight flickered back on. For a split second the light caught. A figure. Tall, elongated, limbs too long, too thin, standing among the mannequins. It blended so perfectly it took Jamie's brain a second to register. It wasn't a mannequin, and it was looking at them. Sinclair fired. The gunshot shattered the silence. The figure jerked violently and vanished. Jamie gasped for air. "What the hell was that?" Mercer shook his head. It was just gone. Then they heard it, the whisper, low, echoing. "You shouldn't have come back." Jamie felt her stomach drop. The sound wasn't coming from one place. It was everywhere. Sinclair gritted her teeth. "We need to move." Richard nodded quickly. "Get to the exit." They started toward the front. Then, the mannequins collapsed. All of them. A deafening crash as plastic bodies hit the floor, breaking apart. Jamie screamed. Sinclair grabbed her arm, pulling her toward the entrance. They reached the door. It wouldn't open. Mercer cursed. "It's locked!" Sinclair shoved her shoulder against it. It wasn't locked before. Then a metallic creak. They turned. The stockroom door was open. Jamie's stomach twisted. Something was inside there, waiting. And then, from deep in the store, a slow dragging sound. Jamie's pulse pounded. They weren't alone. Something was here, watching, hunting, and it wasn't going to let them leave. Jamie's heartbeat pounded in her ears as she yanked at the front door handle, her breath coming fast and uneven. Locked. It was locked. But it hadn't been before. Behind her, Mercer cursed, slamming his shoulder into the glass. "It's not budging." Sinclair spun toward the stockroom. The door, which had been shut just minutes ago, stood wide open. The darkness inside it stretched deep, too deep. Jamie swallowed hard. Something was inside. Something had opened it. Richard's fingers twitched as he reached for his pocket knife. He wasn't sure what a blade would do against whatever was happening, but it was better than nothing. Sinclair turned to Jamie. "The keys. Try the keys." Jamie's hands were shaking violently as she dug through her jacket pocket, pulling out her store key ring. She fumbled with them, trying to jam the master key into the lock. It wouldn't turn. "Come on," Jamie whispered frantically. Mercer turned toward Sinclair. "We're being played with." Sinclair nodded grimly. Then the air changed. A heavy, suffocating pressure filled the store, like the entire building was holding its breath. The emergency lights flickered, the temperature plummeted, and then the mannequins began to rise. One by one, Jamie choked on a scream. They weren't being picked up, they weren't resetting into position, they were pulling themselves upright. Mercer staggered back. No. The plastic figures stood at odd angles, their heads jerking unnaturally as if waking up. Then, in perfect synchronization, they turned, all of them facing the stockroom. Richard froze. What the hell are they doing? Sinclair's grip on her gun tightened. "They're showing us something." Jamie shook her head violently. "No, they're leading us into a trap." But it was too late, because from the darkened stockroom, a footstep, a slow, heavy step against the concrete. Jamie's breath caught. Sinclair raised her gun, stepping in front of Jamie instinctively. Mercer aimed his flashlight into the darkness, and then a shape moved. Not fast, not lunging, slow, deliberate. Jamie could barely breathe as her mind tried to register what she was looking at. It was tall, too tall. At first she thought it was another mannequin, its limbs elongated, its frame impossibly thin, but its skin was wrong. It wasn't plastic, it wasn't human. Its face was smooth, hollow. No eyes, no mouth, just a void where features should be. And yet, Jamie could feel it looking at her, watching. Her throat tightened. The figure stood at the threshold of the stockroom, motionless. Then it took another step forward. Sinclair fired. The gunshot rang through the store, echoing against the shelves. The bullet hit, but the figure didn't bleed. It absorbed the impact, like it had never been shot at all. Then it moved, fast. One moment it was across the room. The next, it was inches from them. Jamie screamed, stumbling backward as Sinclair fired again. Mercer grabbed her arm, pulling her away. "Move!" They raced toward the center of the store, weaving between aisles as the thing stalked forward. Jamie's mind was spinning. The door wouldn't open. The stockroom was worse. They were trapped. Then Richard yelled, "The emergency exit!" Jamie's eyes widened. The back door. If they could reach it. But as soon as the thought crossed her mind, a whisper. Soft, everywhere. Sinclair froze mid-step. Mercer nearly crashed into her. "What the hell are you doing? We need to." Then Jamie saw it. Sinclair's face had gone blank, her eyes unfocused, her flashlight lowered slightly, like she was staring at something they couldn't see. Jamie's blood ran cold. "Sinclair?" No response. Mercer grabbed her shoulder. "Hey!" Sinclair blinked. Then her body jerked violently, as if something had just let go of her. She stumbled back, gasping for breath. I couldn't." Jamie grabbed her arm, eyes wide. "You were staring at it." Sinclair's breath was shaky. "I didn't mean to." Richard shouted from ahead, "Hurry!" Jamie forced her legs to move, half dragging Sinclair as they sprinted for the back exit. The thing didn't run after them. It didn't need to. It just watched, waiting. Jamie reached the emergency door, yanking at the handle. It opened. Cold night air rushed in. They ran. They didn't stop until they were across the parking lot, hearts hammering. Jamie doubled over, gasping. She was shaking. Sinclair was breathing heavily, still trying to process what had happened. Mercer turned back toward the store. It was empty. The mannequins had fallen again. And the thing? Gone. Jamie swallowed hard. We can't go back in there. Sinclair didn't answer. Mercer finally spoke, voice hoarse. We have to, because whatever's in there... He looked at Jamie. It's waiting for someone. The cold night air burned Jamie's lungs as she stood in the parking lot, staring at Peak Performance Outfitters. The store was silent now, its windows reflecting nothing but the streetlights and the vast emptiness beyond. But she knew, they all knew, that it was still in there, watching, waiting. Sinclair tightened her grip on her gun, her jaw clenched. We end this. Mercer exhaled, wiping sweat from his brow. How? Bullets don't work. That thing just absorbed them. Jamie shook her head, heart pounding. We don't fight it. We get rid of it. Richard, still catching his breath, looked at her. How? Jamie's hands trembled, but she forced herself to speak. I've been reading everything I can about this land, about the lodge, the train station. This thing has always been here, and every time someone built over it, it found a way back. Sinclair nodded slowly. So we take away its home. Richard's brow furrowed. You want to burn down my store? Jamie looked at him. Do you want to keep it, knowing what's inside? Silence. Richard ran a hand through his greying hair, shaking his head. He didn't want to do this, but deep down he knew Jamie was right. The store was already lost. Mercer squared his shoulders. Then let's do it. Back inside the store. The air was even heavier now. Jamie felt it the second they stepped inside, like the building itself knew. It knew what they were about to do. Sinclair and Mercer moved quickly, gathering fuel from the camping section, propane tanks, lighter fluid, flammable gear. Richard worked on busting open the gas line in the employee kitchen. Jamie stood near the entrance, flashlight tight in her grip, listening for movement. Then, a whisper. Soft, mocking. Jamie's chest tightened. She turned toward the mannequins. They had moved again, lined up perfectly, facing her. A shiver ran down her spine. They weren't mannequins. They were the things left behind, the ones who had disappeared, Ryan, Daniel, the railway worker. They had never left. Sinclair's voice snapped her back to reality. Jamie, let's go. Jamie ran. She grabbed the bottle of lighter fluid, dumping it across the floor as Richard lit a bundle of rags, setting them ablaze. The flames ignited instantly, crawling up the wooden displays, spreading fast. Then the building shook. Jamie staggered. The mannequins twitched. One of them lurched forward. But this time Jamie didn't run. She grabbed the flare from her pocket, struck it against her jeans, and threw it into the fire. The explosion ripped through the aisles. The force sent them backward, knocking over shelves, rattling glass. Flames consumed the walls, the mannequins, the stockroom. Then it screamed. A sound so deep, so inhuman, it shook Jamie to her core. She turned and saw it. The thing stood in the middle of the flames, twisting, writhing. Its hollow face split open, revealing a darkness deeper than anything Jamie had ever seen. It reached toward them one last time. Then the ceiling collapsed, and the watcher burned. Outside, watching the flames. They stood in the parking lot, watching the fire consume everything. Jamie's hands shook. The fire department was on its way, but she knew there would be nothing left to save. Richard exhaled, staring at the flames, his store, his livelihood, reduced to rubble. But he didn't speak. He just watched. Sinclair lowered her gun. Mercer ran a hand down his face, breathing heavily. Jamie let out a slow, shaky breath. Then the weight lifted. The air no longer felt thick. The world felt normal again. For the first time in months, Silver Pines was free. Sinclair turned to Jamie. You okay? Jamie nodded. Yeah. She looked back at the burning wreckage. The watcher was gone, and it wasn't coming back. Not this time. 1 month later, Silver Pines felt different now. Lighter, freer. Jamie walked down Main Street, the crisp autumn air cool against her face. The town had moved on. The ruins of Peak Performance cleared away. Nothing had been built in its place, and nothing ever would. Sinclair sat across from her at the Pines Cafe, sipping a cup of coffee. So, she said, what now? Jamie shrugged. Start over, figure out what's next. Sinclair nodded. You could be a good detective, you know. Jamie laughed. I think I've had enough of that for a lifetime. They clinked coffee cups, and for the first time in a long time, Jamie felt safe because the watcher was gone, and it would never watch again. What began as a quiet morning in a small mountain town unravelled into a nightmare hidden beneath decades of silence. Peak Performance Outfitters was more than just a store. It was a doorway. and something ancient was waiting on the other side. The watcher is gone, but its shadow still lingers in the corners we dare not look. It doesn't matter if you leave. Once it sees you, it follows.
Every story has an end, but here, the mysteries never stop. Thank you for watching and being a part of this journey into the unknown. Your support keeps these stories alive, and there's plenty more waiting for you. We drop 3 new stories every week, so if you crave suspense, the unexplained and the downright chilling, make sure you're subscribed and ready for what's next. Until then, keep your lights on, your doors locked, and remember, some stories stay with you long after they're told.